They will come, Your Grace, when they're ready.
You didn't conquer them, berated them.
Busy za Daenerys Targaryen. Mo. Dorzalti. Tersko enka derve. Munya za drizolti. Jevite bagon daor. Dervi jerisi di bilos daor. Lomiri ziri. Vis jevis.
Misa!
Misa! Misa!
What does it mean?
It means mother.
Yine Trivagon.
From idealism to imperialism. Setting stage, early Daenerys. At the start of her journey, Daenerys Targaryen stood as a beacon of compassion in a brutal world. She was the girl who wanted to break chains, not forge new ones. Her earliest victories were acts of liberation. The freeing of the Unsullied in Astapor remains one of the most celebrated moments in her story. With clever strategy and moral conviction, she dismantled an entire system of slavery without spilling the blood of her new followers. Her choice to offer them freedom rather than bind them to her service was a testament to her belief in self-determination. Yet even here, a more complex truth lingered. While the Unsullied were free to leave, they overwhelmingly chose to stay. Whether from loyalty, admiration, or a lack of other options, they became the first army she commanded. An army born from an act of emancipation. This was the paradox of the heart of Daenerys' rise. She liberated people, but in doing so, she began to build a power base. Her crucifixion of 103 masters in Meereen was another striking example. On the surface, it was a clear statement against cruelty, retribution for the children nailed to mile markers outside the city. But the punishment was absolute, allowing no room for individual guilt or innocence. In that moment, her justice became collective, and the line between righteous vengeance and political messaging blurred. It was the first glimpse of how her sense of justice could harden into something far less forgiving: the burden of legacy. The name Targaryen was more than a family title. It was a history steeped in conquest, dragons, and fire. For Daenerys, it was both an inspiration and a warning. She often invoked her father's madness as a lesson of what not to become. Yet, the same legacy that cautioned her also tempted her. The stories of Aegon the Conqueror, of the uniting of the Seven Kingdoms through fire and blood, were not just tales of glory. They were reminders of what a Targaryen could achieve when unyielding will met overwhelming power. The deeper she stepped into the role of ruler, the more her self-image intertwined with the myth of her bloodline. The idea of the rightful queen was not just political rhetoric, it became part of her identity. She spoke often of her destiny, and with each city she conquered, that destiny felt less like a goal and more like an inevitability. This burden of legacy subtly altered her moral compass. Where she once spoke of freeing the oppressed, she now spoke of taking what is mine and restoring my house. And as history shows, the weight of a crown can bend even the most idealistic of rulers toward the iron grip of authority. First, cracks in the ideal. The first cracks in her idealism appeared long before Westeros. In Meereen, her well-intentioned rule was tested by political instability and insurgency. The Sons of the Harpy, masked killers who struck at her soldiers and supporters, forced Daenerys into a corner. In response, she began making decisions less rooted in her original ideals and more in the need to maintain control. Public executions, political marriages, and even the reopening of the fighting pits, things she once opposed, became concessions she made to keep her throne secure. Her anger, too, began to shift in tone. In earlier years, her fury was the fury of the oppressed, righteous, protective, aimed squarely at the powerful who abused the weak. But as challenges to her rule mounted, that fury began to extend to anyone who defied her, regardless of their reasons. What had once been the language of justice became the language of authority. A telling moment came when she faced the leaders of Yunkai and Astapor after they defied her peace terms. She didn't merely demand submission, she demanded unconditional obedience. Her words carried the weight of someone who saw compromise as weakness, a dangerous mindset for a ruler with dragons at her command. Even the loyalty of her closest advisors could not shield her from this change. Sir Barristan Selmy, Tyrion Lannister, and Jorah Mormont, all, at different points, tried to temper her instincts. Sometimes she listened, often she did not. Each time she overrode their counsel, it became easier to believe that her vision alone was the right one. That dissent was an obstacle rather than a safeguard, the turning point. When Daenerys finally set sail for Westeros, she carried not only her armies and dragons but also the accumulated weight of years spent as both liberator and conqueror. Her arrival was framed as the return of a rightful heir, but her methods were increasingly shaped by the struggles of her past. She no longer sought merely to persuade or inspire. She was prepared to demand and enforce. It was here that her idealism began its final transformation. Surrounded by powerful allies, she was also surrounded by reminders of betrayal, rebellion, and the fragility of loyalty. The Targaryen words, "fire" and "blood," took on a new meaning for her. They were no longer just an inheritance. They became a warning she was willing to make real. In the wars to come, the girl who had once freed cities at great personal risk would make choices that blurred the line between justice and domination beyond recognition. Her belief in her destiny became unshakable, and with it came a willingness to shape the world through fear if love was not enough, foreshadowing the fall. Looking back, the seeds of Daenerys' eventual descent were planted early. Her uncompromising actions in Meereen, her growing reliance on the Targaryen mythos, and her gradual shift from breaker of chains to queen by right were not sudden changes, but part of a long evolution. By the time she reached King's Landing, her idealism had been tested, strained, and reshaped by years of ruling in hostile lands. Her initial dream of a freer, kinder world was still there, but it was bound tightly to her own claim to power. In her mind, the two had become inseparable. To reject her rule was to reject justice itself. This is the tragedy of Daenerys Targaryen, that her journey from idealism to imperialism was not a betrayal of her character, but a fulfillment of it. The same unyielding will that freed the Unsullied was the will that burned cities. The same passion that inspired the oppressed also silenced dissent. And in the end, the girl who wanted to break chains would forge chains of her own, made not of iron, but of fire. Paranoia does not take root overnight. For Daenerys Targaryen, it began as the faint rustle of whispers in dark corners. A subtle unease that the world was not as loyal, not as safe as she had once believed. The Sons of the Harpy struck like shadows in the alleys of Meereen, faceless enemies hiding behind gold masks and the smiling masks of ordinary citizens. They weren't just rebels, they were the embodiment of a terrifying truth. Not everyone wanted to be saved by her. Every attack on her, unsullied, was a blade to her sense of security. Every assassin unmasked was proof that the enemy could be anyone, anywhere. At first, Daenerys approached these threats with the determination of a queen who believed she could outthink and outfight her opponents. But constant vigilance is exhausting. It wears down trust, and Daenerys began to see danger in every shadow, betrayal in every delayed word. And then came the betrayals that weren't just imagined. Some were political. The great masters of Meereen who pretended to bend the knee only to funnel gold to her enemies. Others were more personal, quiet fractures among her council. Ser Jorah Mormont, her once trusted advisor, revealed to have spied on her for Robert Baratheon in her earliest days. It didn't matter that he had changed sides, that his devotion had become genuine. The fact that he had lied at all was a wound that never quite healed. Tyrion Lannister, brilliant yet cynical, proved an invaluable strategist, but even he questioned her judgment at times. A challenge she increasingly took as disloyalty rather than healthy debate. And then there was Missandei, her voice of reason, whose counsel she cherished, until Missandei was ripped from her side and publicly executed. That loss was more than personal grief. It was an amputation of her moral compass. With every loss, her inner circle shrank. And as it shrank, her decisions became less about consensus and more about the solitary conviction of a woman who believed she was the only one who could see clearly. But clarity can become a dangerous thing when it is unchallenged. By the time Daenerys turned her gaze fully westward toward Westeros, the Iron Throne was no longer just a seat of power. It was an inheritance denied, a symbol of wrongs done to her family, a crown she had been promised since childhood. It called to her, not as a tool to enact justice, but as the proof of her destiny. This was the siren song of the Iron Throne. In Essos, she had fought for others, freeing the Unsullied, unchaining the slaves of Yunkai, and bringing the whip-wielding masters of Astapor to their knees. But in Westeros, the stakes became personal. Here was the land of her birth, stolen from her by Robert's rebellion, soaked in the blood of her murdered kin. And here, at last, was her chance to take it back. The tragedy was that in reaching for that throne, she began to believe that everything, every risk, every cost, was justified in service of her claim. She had once believed that rulers must earn their crowns through the consent of the people. But as the campaigns wore on, and as Westerosi lords eyed her with suspicion, that belief began to wither. When lords bent the knee, she doubted their sincerity. When they refused, she saw not principled opposition, but treason. The fine line between justice and vengeance blurred. The paranoia grew louder with each battle. In her mind, she was surrounded not by cautious allies, but by would-be traitors. Sansa Stark's guarded defiance became proof of northern disloyalty. Jon Snow's quiet integrity became a threat when she learned of his true parentage. Even those who swore undying loyalty, like Grey Worm, could not shield her from the gnawing fear that one day they, too, might turn. In this narrowing mental space, dissent was no longer a sign of healthy governance. It was a challenge to her destiny. And challenges had to be met with strength, or with fire. She had seen her father, the Mad King, fall because he was abandoned in his hour of need. She would not make the same mistake. Better to rule through awe and fear than risk being undone by trust misplaced. The seeds of paranoia had been planted years earlier, in the alleys of Meereen and the halls of Astapor, watered by betrayal and loss. By the time she reached King's Landing, those seeds had grown into a forest, thick, tangled, and impenetrable to any voice that might have urged restraint. This was no longer the Daenerys who had walked barefoot through the Red Waste, who had cradled newborn dragons with a mixture of wonder and humility. This was a queen who had crossed deserts and oceans, who had seen friends murdered, who had been betrayed in both small and seismic ways, and who had learned that the only person she could truly depend on was herself. To her, the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who were with her and those who were against her. And the against column was growing faster than the with. The tragic irony is that many of the threats she feared into existence may never have come to pass. But paranoia is not a rational state. It doesn't ask for evidence. It feeds on possibilities. And in the mind of Daenerys Targaryen, every possibility of betrayal was a certainty waiting to happen. So when the bells of King's Landing rang in surrender, they did not sound to her like the end of bloodshed. They sounded like another trap, another false gesture of mercy that would, in time, rise to destroy her. The girl who had once freed slaves now saw herself as the sole arbiter of what the world needed. The Mother of Dragons had become the mother of a new order, one in which her will alone would shake the realm because trusting anyone else had proved too dangerous. That is how idealism withers into absolutism. That is how a queen becomes a conqueror. And that is how the seeds of paranoia, once planted, bloom into fire. From the very beginning, Daenerys Targaryen framed her mission as one of liberation. She had freed the unsullied, broken the chains of the oppressed, and cast herself as the breaker of tyrants. But as her journey wore on, the lines between justice and vengeance blurred. The most dangerous part? She didn't see the blur at all. In her mind, every action, no matter how violent or final, was in service of the greater good. If thousands had to burn so that millions could live in freedom, then the flames were not cruelty, they were mercy. At least, that's how she told herself the story. She had seen the rot of old systems, the cruelty of masters, the deceit of lords. She had learned, again and again, that kindness was often answered with daggers. So why bother with the slow work of winning hearts when fear could secure obedience in a single moment? This greater good fallacy became a shield against doubt. When her enemies called her actions barbaric, she brushed them off as the cries of the corrupt. When her allies questioned her judgment, she branded them as weak or short-sighted. In her view, compromise meant prolonging suffering. Hesitation meant allowing injustice to breathe another day. And so, step by step, she walked away from the benevolent queen she once aspired to be, believing all the while that she was still her. It was here that Dracarys became her most trusted argument. At first, Dragonfire was a tool of last resort, a final card to play when diplomacy failed or cruelty demanded a swift and terrifying end. But over time, it became the opening move, the default answer. Dragons simplified the world. With one word, she could erase resistance, end a debate, silence the opposition forever. A master refuses to bow. Dracarys. A city defies her claim. Dracarys. A ruler she deems unjust. Dracarys. The temptation was obvious. No drawn-out sieges, no endless councils, no tangled web of alliances. Just fire and ash, and a problem that no longer existed. In her mind, Dragonfire wasn't destruction. It was purification. The world, she believed, would thank her when the smoke cleared, but that belief came with a price. Every time she unleashed fire, it became harder to justify why she shouldn't. When enemies burned, it felt righteous. When innocents burned, it became an unfortunate necessity. The more she relied on her dragons, the more human costs faded into the background, eclipsed by the shining vision of the better world she would build. Mercy, meanwhile, became a fragile currency she could no longer afford. In Meereen, she had granted mercy to former masters willing to serve under her new order, only to see some of them plotting her downfall. In Westeros, she offered Jon Snow the choice to bend the knee rather than burn. Yet each refusal she faced only deepened her resolve that leniency bred defiance. Every act of clemency was met with whispers of betrayal, every open hand answered by a clenched fist. In time, she stopped offering the choice at all. Her patience, once a defining strength, hardened into a cold certainty. They would follow her because they loved her, or they would follow her because they feared her. But they would follow her. That shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in like a slow winter, each frost forming invisibly until the ground was too hard to till. Losing Sir Barristan. Jorah's repeated betrayals, Tyrion's costly mistakes, each wound made her trust less and command more. Even the few who remained loyal found themselves edged out of her inner circle, replaced not by advisors, but by obedience. She began to see herself not merely as a ruler, but as a savior. and saviors, she believed, did not ask permission. Play acted. If others could not see her vision, it was because their eyes were clouded by tradition, fear, or greed. If they resisted, it only proved the necessity of her fire. Yet the truth, the part she never allowed herself to speak, was that the fire was as much for her as it was for them. Every victory scorched into the earth by her dragons felt like proof that she was right, that her destiny was real, that she was the chosen one who would break the wheel. Without that certainty, what was she? Just another pretender with a claim and a dream. And so, the logic of the greater good became unshakable. It didn't matter how high the cost was today, because tomorrow it would all be worth it. The dead would be forgotten, the burned cities rebuilt, the scorched earth made green again. But under her rule, and only hers, her enemies called her tyrant, her followers called her queen. Daenerys called herself both liberator and executioner, and in her mind there was no contradiction. For the world she envisioned to rise, the old one had to burn. And she, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, would be the one to light the match. The tragedy, of course, was that by the time the world saw what she had become, she had stopped caring what the world thought. The woman who once walked through fire for the powerless had become the fire itself. Missandei's death and its aftermath. If Daenerys Targaryen's journey had been defined by a balance between fury and mercy, the moment Missandei was executed shattered that fragile equilibrium. Standing on the walls of King's Landing, in chains, Missandei's calm but defiant cry, "Dracarys," was not merely a final act of loyalty, but a spark thrown into a powder keg that had been building for years. This was not the loss of a political ally or military strategist. Missandei was a rare constant in Daenerys' life, a confidant who had no agenda other than the Queen's happiness and justice. Her death was personal in a way no other betrayal had been. Jorah's passing had wounded Daenerys deeply, but it came in the heat of battle, a sacrifice in service of the greater cause. Missandei's execution was cold, deliberate, and symbolic. A hostage killed in front of her closest friends, a message from Cersei that the Game of Thrones had entered its most ruthless phase. In that moment, the possibility of diplomacy evaporated. Daenerys was already fraying under the weight of isolation, but Missandei's final word was a license for vengeance. It was a call to burn away the old order, not piece by piece, but in one great consuming blaze, the Mad Queen's gaze. From that point forward, the Daenerys who had walked through fire to save the oppressed was gone. What remained was a ruler with eyes fixed on a single, unshakable truth. Fear was a more reliable tool than love. Her entrance into King's Landing during the final battle was not the march of a liberator. It was the arrival of a conqueror. The showrunners gave us subtle but chilling visual cues. The wind catching her hair in sharp, almost chaotic bursts, the camera holding on her face longer than comfort allowed, the narrowing of her gaze as the bells of surrender rang out. These weren't just shots for dramatic effect, they were invitations to watch her decision-making process in real time. We could see it. The battle was won, the city was hers, and yet the fire in her eyes had not been quenched. It was the same look her father, the Mad King Aerys, must have worn when he ordered King's Landing to burn. For years, Daenerys had rejected comparisons to him. Now, in the space between those ringing bells and Drogon's first blast of fire, she embraced them. The audience knew, instinctively, that there would be no turning back. Foreshadowing from the past. To understand this transformation, we have to look backward. The seeds of the Mad Queen persona were planted long before the siege of King's Landing. In Meereen, she had crucified masters by the hundreds, without distinguishing between the guilty and the merely complicit. In Astapor, she had burned the slaver Krasnys without a trial. In Korth, she had locked the warlock Pyat Pri in his own chains and left him to die. At the time, these acts were celebrated. By her followers, by the freed slaves, even by much of the audience. The narrative framed them as righteous comeuppance for cruel oppressors. But each of these moments blurred the line between justice and vengeance just a little more. Each victory reinforced the idea that fire and blood were not only effective, but perhaps the only language her enemies would ever understand. And then there was her family history. Targaryens were known for two things: dragons and madness. Viserys, her brother, was consumed by his own paranoia and ambition. Her father's reign had ended in an obsession with burning his enemies alive. Even her visions in the House of the Undying carried echoes of this path. The ruined throne room of the Red Keep, ash drifting like snow. It's important to remember, Daenerys was raised in exile with only the romanticized tales of her family's power, not the reality of their brutality. But when betrayal and loss stripped away the softer edges of her identity, those darker ancestral instincts found fertile ground. By the time she sat atop Drogon, looking down on a surrendered city, those instincts had fully taken root. No way back. Missandei's death was not just a personal loss, it was the final removal of any voice in her council urging restraint. Tyrion still tried to reach her, but his credibility was in tatters. Jon Snow could appeal to her compassion, but his loyalty to the Stark family was always a shadow in her mind. Grey Worm shared her thirst for vengeance, making him an accelerant rather than a brake. Once the bells rang, Daenerys saw only one course of action: to end the cycle of betrayal by making an example so devastating that no one would ever dare challenge her again. In her mind, this was not madness, it was deterrence. It was the same logic that had once led her to crucify masters, to burn Khals alive in their own temple. The scale had changed, but the philosophy had not. When Drogon's fire swept across King's Landing, it wasn't random destruction. It was the calculated annihilation of a city she believed was complicit in resisting her. The fact that thousands of innocents died was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the point. In her mind, this was the price of the better world she had always promised. The Daenerys who rode out of the ashes of King's Landing was a different queen entirely. Her speeches no longer spoke of breaking chains, but of uniting the entire world under her rule, by any means necessary. The moral compass that once guided her had been replaced by a singular, unyielding belief in her destiny. And once a ruler convinces themselves that they alone know what is best for the world, the difference between justice and tyranny ceases to matter. When we step back from the fire and smoke of Daenerys Targaryen's final days, the tragedy becomes sharper, almost cruel in its clarity. The arc that once promised emancipation ended in ash. And perhaps the most devastating truth is this: the very qualities that once made her a figure of inspiration, her unwavering strength, her unshakable conviction, and her relentless desire for justice, were the same forces that propelled her towards her downfall. In the early seasons, these traits were lifelines. Strength allowed her to survive betrayal and exile. Conviction helped her challenge the world's most entrenched institutions of slavery and oppression. Her desire for justice inspired not only her followers, but also the audience watching from afar. These were the bedrocks of the breaker of chains, a woman who refused to bow to tradition, who sought to remake the world in a better image. But in Westeros, those virtues calcified into something darker. Her strength became rigidity, a refusal to bend when bending might have preserved what she loved. Her conviction hardened into self-righteousness, a belief that she alone held the truth of what was just. Her quest for justice began to blur with vengeance, each new act of violence framed as a necessary purging of evil. By the end, what had once been inspirational now demanded fear and obedience. The tragic irony. It is tempting to see Daenerys' descent as inevitable, almost predestined. The show itself lays this groundwork: whispered warnings of Targaryen madness, visions of destruction, and the haunting precedent of her ancestors. But what makes her story resonate is the fact that this descent was not inevitable in the way destiny stories usually are. It was a slow accretion of choices, each one rationalized in the moment, each one wrapped in the language of liberation and the greater good. That is where the tragedy lives, not in the idea that she was born mad, but in the notion that she might have been something else. If she had died in Meereen, the histories might have remembered her as a flawless liberator. If she had stopped in Dragonstone, she might have been immortalized as a ruler who refused to spill needless blood. Instead, she pushed forward, driven by both ambition and an almost messianic belief that her vision was the only one worth following. Her virtues became vices, not in spite of her intentions, but because of them. The audience's role. There's another uncomfortable truth here, and it's one the series asks us to grapple with. We, the audience, played a part in her rise and fall. For years, we cheered when she ordered Dracarys. We thrilled at the sight of her enemies burning, never pausing to think what those flames might mean if turned on innocents. When she crucified the masters of Meereen, we called it justice. When she locked Xaro Exo and Daxos in his vault to die, we saw it as retribution. When she threatened to raze cities unless her enemies bent the knee, we viewed it as strength. We rationalized every act, because the victims were framed as villains, slavers, usurpers, traitors. By the time she reached King's Landing, our trust in her moral compass was so ingrained that the warning signs seemed like background noise. It wasn't until the bells rang and the fire rained down that we were forced to confront what had been there all along. The same tools she used to destroy the wicked could just as easily destroy the innocent. Her story challenges us to ask, how often do we excuse brutality when it aligns with our desired outcomes? How often do we forgive excesses in our heroes because we've invested in their triumph? Lessons for today. Stripped of dragons and fantasy kingdoms, Daenerys' arc feels chillingly relevant to the modern world. It's a study in the seduction of power, the perils of absolute conviction, and the dangerous dehumanization of one's opponents. In politics, in movements, even in personal relationships, the belief that I am right and therefore my methods are justified can lead to disastrous ends. History is filled with leaders who began as revolutionaries, only to become the very tyrants they overthrew. The rhetoric of liberation can mask authoritarian instincts, and good intentions can pave the road to ruin. Daenerys' tragedy is also a warning about isolation, as her inner circle shrank. Through death, betrayal, and mistrust, she lost the perspectives that might have tempered her worst impulses. In a world where dissent was framed as disloyalty, the feedback loop of her own certainty only grew stronger. The lesson is painfully clear. Unchecked power thrives in silence, and conviction without accountability becomes a weapon. Her final act, the destruction of King's Landing, is an extreme, fictionalized version of a very real human tendency to see the other side, not as people, but as obstacles to be removed. Once that line is crossed, mercy becomes weakness, and annihilation becomes not just an option, but a moral imperative, rewriting the ending in our minds. It is impossible to watch Daenerys' journey without wondering how it could have been different. What if she had listened to Tyrion one last time? What if Jon Snow had confronted her more directly before the bells rang? What if the weight of her losses had been met with compassion rather than suspicion? But perhaps that's part of the story's enduring hold, the knowledge that the ending feels both shocking and inevitable. In our minds, we can rewrite it 100 different ways, but in the world of Westeros, with its long memories and bloody histories, maybe there was only one way it could end. A complicated legacy. Daenerys Targaryen will be remembered in universe in wildly different ways. To the freedmen of Slaver's Bay, she will always be Misa, the mother who broke their chains. To the survivors of King's Landing, she will be a destroyer, a tyrant who rained fire without mercy. To her followers, she will be the rightful queen, betrayed before she could finish her work. For us, her legacy is even more complex. She is a reminder that heroes are not static figures. They are shaped by their environments, their choices, and the pressures we place upon them. She forces us to question the lines we draw between justice and vengeance, strength and cruelty, leadership and domination. And perhaps most hauntingly, she leaves us with this truth: the same fire that can warm and protect can also consume.